right, what is up, y'all? Thanks for taking a look at our week 7 conclusion video. We spent a lot of time this week discussing, talking, reading, and writing about the culture of the 1920s, the societal developments of the 1920s, right? We discussed the urban culture, right, with the Harlem Renaissance and women and challenging gender roles. We talked about some of the conservative responses to these changes, right, with immigration restriction and prohibition of alcohol and the KKK, as well as the conflicts between science and religion that begin cropping up in the 1920s, as best exemplified with the Scopes monkey trial. So all that being said, the 20s are a time of great change, a time of social dynamics that certainly carry us into a much more modern era. And that's incredibly important. So I hope that our live session or your extension activity this week both yielded the opportunity for you to really begin engaging in the social and cultural developments of the 20s. But for today, I want to talk to you about the economics of the 1920s. And the way I titled today's lecture is The Boom Before the Bust. Right? Because we're going to see incredible growth in the 1920s, fueled by a return to laissez-faire, non-regulatory, pro-business policies. And this boom, 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 boom up of the 1920s is going to, as we know from Gilded Age past, lead to a colossal downturn at the end of the decade. I think about the parallels, and I think it's important that you begin thinking in the same manner, but the parallels to, for example, like the Panic of 1893, the Panic of 1873, right? Unregulated extreme growth of business capitalism. Then when that bubble bursts, it goes down. And like I told you during the Gilded Age, right, the bigger the economy, the bigger the boom, the larger the fall, which is why at the end of the 1920s, we find ourselves in what is now known as the Great Depression, because it is in fact the worst economic downturn in American history. And it really is frankly without peer in its longevity, in its depth, and in its impact. So in order to figure out how we're going to fall so quickly, we got to figure out how we're going to rise so quickly, which is why today we're talking about the economics of the 1920s. Now, understanding, of course, that the 1920s are dominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party has come back away from the era of Roosevelt and Taft, when the Republican Party was embracing a more regulatory, more hands-on government approach. After World War I, the Republican Party is going to go back to its old guard roots, Gilded Age roots of pro-business, right, pro-tariff, hands-off, anti-regulation, et cetera. And that's going to give us the 1920s with the 3 Republican presidents of the 1920s. We can see here on my election maps that I included there for you, that includes all 3 elections that are going to characterize the 1920s. We see 1920, the election of Warren G. Harding, America's original Warren G. It's a joke for some of you old school hip hop heads. Warren G. round 1. Warren G. Harding is going to die in office and be succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who is then going to run for president on his own accord in 1924, winning a large majority there. And crazy enough, like Herbert Hoover is going to run in 1928. And even Herbert Hoover, because of the prosperity of the 20s, he as a Republican is going to get some Southern votes, right? Just keep this in mind that this is largely without Black voters because of restrictions on voting, disenfranchisement of Black voters. So think about like the significance of the Republican Party, the party of abolition, the party of civil rights, the party of Reconstruction, getting white votes in the South, right? You begin starting to see the parties coalescing into the coalitions that we see from Republicans and Democrats today, as the Republicans are able to win white votes in the South in places like Texas, places like North Carolina, Virginia, that have traditionally been white Democrat strongholds. So during this decade, we're going to see the Republican Party working to restrict progressive reforms, working to, as Warren G. Harding says when he's elected, a return to normalcy, right? I'm going to emphasize this point about 16 times this week, that the return to normalcy does not mean normal before World War I. It means normal for the rest of American history, right? In which the government is largely laissez-faire, hands-off, pro-business, facilitation of commerce, at the expense of everyday people, right? So they're going to limit progressive reforms. We're going to see in the 1920s a very close relationship between the government and business, as private business is going to boom. And we're going to see the continuation of a foreign policy based not on a large military, but on the investment of U.S. businesses in the world, as, again, the priority will be business. All right, so these three election maps are going to be determinative of really the last stand for a little bit of Republican Party in power, as because of the 1920s, when we see the such drastic downturn of the economy, the Democrats will seize power. They're going to hold power through the next couple decades, really, between the Great Depression and World War II and the 1950s. But we'll get there when we get there. So it's important to note that America in the 20s is incredibly changed by really the long-term industrialization of the Gilded Age. Right, this is a long-term consequence. We look at the Gilded Age industrialism is really beginning with the Civil War and carrying through the Progressive era into the early 19-teens. This industrial capacity changes American society forever. During the Gilded Age, with industrial goods, right, like railroads and steel, and oil, right, and mass production. And then in the 1920s with consumer goods. Also aided is the economic boom of World War I. As we looked at this at the very tail end of last week's lecture, we looked at how much the U.S. is exporting to the Allied powers, right, to England, to France, and elsewhere, and how much that fuels the economy. So that during the 1920s, the U.S. is really without peer as the most wealthy and most developed nation in the world, right? The rest of the world, not the rest of the world, but the rest of the developed world in Europe is rebuilding from World War I. We don't have that problem since World War I didn't happen here. And the US has really seized on the progress of the Industrial Revolution, industrialization during the Gilded Age, to become the foremost economic power in the world. It is World War I that creates the US as a lending nation, not a borrowing nation, meaning we're like giving other countries loans to facilitate their economies, as opposed to vice versa. It's a big change in just 100 years, really, right? From the early 1800s, when other countries are impressing our sailors and taking our boats, and we can't do anything about them, right? Think back to like the Embargo Act of 1807 with Jefferson. And he's like, stop taking our boats and sailors. We're not going to trade with anybody. That'll teach you a lesson, right? And England and France are like, we don't really care. That's fine. Good for you. You take your ball and go home. We don't need it. Right now they need us. We are an industrial producing nation that the rest of the world is reliant on. For the workers themselves, we're going to see wages rising in the 1920s as work hours decline. The average work week, is going to decline from the low to mid 50s a week, 50 hours a week, to the mid 40s a week. As Americans then are going to use this extra time and this extra money to access new innovative consumer goods that are going to improve the quality of life. They're going to improve the standard of living in the 1920s. So we're going to see really a second big industrial boom during the 1920s. It's going to be similar to the Gilded Age in some ways, but also a little different in some ways. Similar in that it's characterized by mass production. And with mass production comes a decrease in prices, right? The more you produce, the less you can charge for it. So like the Gilded Age, we're going to see a huge increase in production, thus a decrease in prices. But whereas the Gilded Age is largely industrial goods, the 1920s is largely consumer goods, goods for people's homes, appliances, right? Like washing machines, refrigerators, cars from Ford, radios are maybe the most significant consumer good in the 1920s. I would say radios or cars really are neck and neck in the race for the most significant consumer good that characterizes the second industrial boom. Furniture, clothing as well. In the 1920s, we're going to see electricity finally surpass steam power, as over 70% of homes will be electric powered by the end of the 1920s. And a continuation from the Gilded Age, we're going to continue seeing this growth of the middle class, right? Executives that are managers, plant managers, that are going to really keep embracing this Taylorism approach, right, of managing the workload to increase efficiency, using a more scientific approach, right? Scientific management, Taylorism. Additionally, in the 1920s, we're going to really start seeing a more shared American culture because of the increase in national name brands, because you can buy the same brand of clothing, right, in Los Angeles as you could in New York. You can buy the same appliance, the same car. So we're going to see, and you can listen to the same ads on the radio. So we're going to start seeing American culture become more national instead of regional or localized. Additionally, because of the car, we're going to see the advent of roads being paved aggressively, and with roads comes billboards. With billboards comes more consumerism, and with more consumerism comes, again, a more shared national culture, as people all over the country are looking at the same types of ads, same types of consumer goods that are being advertised to them to buy. Now, the 20s, like I said, consumerism in the 20s is going to lead to a much higher standard of living, especially for the middle and upper classes. We're going to see new household appliances like refrigerators, like washing machines, like vacuum cleaners, things that are just in the house now are revolutionary goods in the 1920s because they make women's lives much easier, right? The domestic housewife now can cook food much easier, can refrigerate their food for longer, can wash their clothes much quicker, can clean the house much quicker, which is going to free up some time for women who are largely not working, and the women are going to fill that time, right, with entertainment, with radio, with going out, right? So we're going to start seeing these time-saving appliances are really going to improve the standard of living for the domestic wife. Again, we see in both cases, one of the other key characteristics that's really important in the 1920s is mass media and advertising. Right here, we see this new stove, right? The gold medal Glenwood stove advertises perfect baking, make cooking easy, right? Next next advertisement for refrigerators, make entertaining simple, right? It's easier to have people over and feed them because you have a refrigerator, right? The idea of both of these advertisements is that you're appealing to women in making their domestic lives more efficient and easier. Advertisement in consumer goods also, we see Listerine, right? Still a product today. Some of y'all need. The question, I love it. It's this guy kissing a woman, and he asks, "How's your breath today? If it's bad, you won't be welcome." Fair, right? You can't be kissing people with bad breath. Nobody likes that. Freshen your breath though. Get some Listerine. Everybody has it. Only Listerine succeeds, right? But again, we're like this idea of advertisement is bringing Americans into a shared culture. We're also seeing advertisement that is heavily dominated by this new phenomenon in the 1920s, which is celebrities. I talked about this in our live session with athletes and movie stars and musicians. But here's Babe Ruth, right? Famous baseball player. Babe Ruth says, "This is the finest cola I ever tasted. Red Rock Cola, 5 cents." Right? Does Babe Ruth actually think that? Who knows? Right? Babe Ruth's a big man. He probably drinks a lot of cola. He probably has a strong opinion. It doesn't matter. But here he's being used as an advertisement, like we see today, right? You see celebrities in car commercials and food commercials and Gatorade commercials and clothes commercials all the time. And this really is a phenomenon that starts in the 1920s. Here's another Babe Ruth advertisement. This one for Old Gold cigarettes. I always crack up looking at this because the idea of an athlete today advertising for cigarettes would be unheard of, but it's the freaking 1920s, and Babe Ruth smoked cigarettes in the dugout during baseball games because he's freaking Babe Ruth and it's the 1920s. So again, another example of mass media advertising and consumerism. The idea that you want to buy these cigarettes or that Coke, that cola because Babe Ruth said so. So consumerism is going to also lead to new forms of mass media that are designed for the consumer. Radios are going to see a significant increase. Radios are the most significant form of mass media in the 1920s. Radios for news, radios for shows, right? Like before TV shows, people listened to radio shows, right? With plot lines and all sorts of fun things. And movies. Movie theaters are going to boom in the 1920s. As Americans are going to embrace their leisure time and their spending money to go to movies. The first few years of movies are only silent movies, which sounds terrible, but people loved them because you don't know the alternative. But the first, what's called a talkie, talk about in a second, but the first movie with audio also comes out here in the 1920s. NBC is the first successful radio network, and as we're seeing radio networks pop up nationwide, this is again contributing to a shared culture as Americans all over the country can listen to the same radio programs. 100 million Americans go to the movies in 1929 every week, right? So Americans are really embracing the movie theaters as a way to find entertainment. right? Charlie Chaplin is a very, very famous actor at the time, largely in silent films. Here he is in The Kid. Unfortunately for Charlie Chaplin, he has this cool little small mustache that used to be called a Charlie Chaplin until Hitler came along and then kind of stole his mustache idea. And now you can't really come back from that. Once Hitler has that mustache, nobody can really pull it off anymore. Such is life. Poor Charlie. And here it is, the jazz singer, Al Jolson, again, a movie star, a celebrity. And this is the first quote unquote talkie, or the first film with audio, with noise, with sound. Now, despite all of this apparent success, despite all of this prosperity, this might sound familiar, the Roaring Twenties are not as prosperous of a decade as it appeared on the surface. You may be thinking to yourself, man, Winch, sounds a lot like the Gilded Age. You'd be correct. There are three big industries that are going to be suffering, and these are three of the most core industries in the American economy at this time. Railroads are going to struggle. Why? Cars. Cotton is going to struggle. Why? New synthetic fabrics and European competition post World War I. And coal is going to struggle. Why? Electricity. So these three, if you think about it, like railroads, huge industry in the Gilded Age, cotton, the entire Southern economy, and coal, also huge in the Gilded Age, like big foundational structural industries in our economy are all struggling because of new competition. Right? Big businesses have invested a lot of money into these big industries. Also, farmers are having a rough time. We make an argument that farmers actually enter the Great Depression before the Great Depression actually starts for the rest of the country. And that farmers have a huge increase in their demand during World War I as they're feeding the rest of the industrialized world, because Europe is so busy fighting this war. But a huge decline in post-war demand is going to deflate and really make farm prices drop a whole lot. And just like in the 1890s, when farmers turned to populism because they can't they're not able to make a profit when prices are dropping, here farmers are having a very, very hard time as well. So those are four big industries that are having a really hard time in the 1920s: railroad, cotton, coal, and farming. So much so that farm per capita income, the average farmer is making significantly less than half of what the average American worker is making in a year. So the average American is making $681 a year, crazy, whereas farmers are making on average a little under 300. So farmers are having a hard time, as well as these other industries. Additionally, even in cities, things look really good. They look really successful. Right, 1920 is a big turning point year because it's the first time over 50% of Americans live in cities. We can see this trend. It's a really important trend. One of the most important characteristics of the post-Civil War post-Civil War America is this significant decline in rural population and a significant increase in urban population, right? And you can attribute this significantly to industrialization and immigration. But the economy is booming with all these people living in cities and buying goods and living it up. The stock market is way, way, way up. Unfortunately, one of the underlying problems that I would like you to identify is people are buying these stocks on margin. Right? I'll explain it a little more next week, but buying on margin means I'm going to buy it now, pay for it later. Right? It's like a credit card, which is fine on goods, but on stocks, it's incredibly dangerous. Unless you buy it on margin, buy it on credit, I'd say $100 a share, right? And then you owe all that money. You're going to pay monthly payments to pay for that stock. What happens when the stock drops in value? Then you're paying for something that is not even as valuable as it was when you bought it. So people are buying, everybody and their mother's buying stocks because it looks like the prosperity is going to last forever. People are buying these stocks on margin, on credit. Also in the 1920s, what's fueling the large consumer-based economy is installment plans, credit, right? I really want that refrigerator, but I can't afford it. Oh, don't worry. 10 monthly payments of whatever. I really want that new Ford, but I can't afford it. Oh, don't worry about it. All right, 30 years of monthly payments would be good to go. So much of the prosperity of the 1920s is wrapped up in a buy now, pay later approach and economy, which is fine But what happens when later happens, right? What happens if you can't pay those bills, right? What happens when those bills come due and, like, for example, those stocks that you bought that were $100 when you bought them per share are now at $12, right? Like how do we reckon with that economically speaking, which one of the reasons that we get into the Great Depression in the 1920s. And underlying all of this is advertising. And advertising is selling the idea that you have to have more, you have to have new, you have to have different, you have to have the car, you have to have the refrigerator. It's going to make your life so much better. Your neighbors all have it. Right? So this advertising industry in the 1920s is very, very responsible for this manipulation of consumer demand to convince people that they need to have more. Now, the presidencies of the 1920s also don't necessarily help slow this unregulated growth. Warren G. Harding, as we discussed earlier, is elected on this promise of a return to normalcy, which is, of course, not a return to progressive policies, but a return to 19th century pre-Roosevelt Republican policies. With it, he approves of the Budget and Accounting Act, which requires the president to submit their budget to Congress, again, in some senses weakening the presidency. Under Warren G. Harding, though, we also see it's his presidency that authorizes the Emergency Quota Act that we talked about last week and in our live session this week, the Emergency Quota Act on immigration, which drops immigration to 3% of the 1910 census. That's going to then be followed up under Coolidge with the National Origins Act, which is more permanent. Under Harding, we see a new tariff, the Forney-McCumber tariff of 1922, is going to be very traditional, right? Very traditional Republican policy of a pro-business tariff. In this case, it's a huge increase in tariff rates, specifically on industrialized goods to protect American industries, right? But as we talked about with tariffs before, that then can in some ways artificially inflate the cost of goods. Warren G. Harding's presidency is going to be doomed by scandals, much like Ulysses S. Grant during Reconstruction, a presidency that has a lot of scandals that it appears as if the president is not involved in the scandals, but because they happen under his watch, it helps drag down the presidency. The big one under him is the Teapot Dome scandal, in which one of his cabinet secretaries is taking bribes to loan federal lands to oil companies to drill, right? This protection of federal lands was one of the hallmarks of the progressive era with conservation with Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir. But here we see the Republicans again repudiating those progressive roots and going back to the pro-business ideology, letting big business borrow federal lands to drill for oil. That's not good. We also see some fraud and bribery in the Veterans Bureau, the bureau that's established to help pay pensions to World War I veterans. And his attorney general is bribed by basically everybody. It's a hot mess. His attorney general is incredibly corrupt. And this is the guy responsible for America's law enforcement. And he's just being bribed by all sorts of fools. Keeping in mind, too, that this is when we're supposed to be enforcing prohibition, and Warren G. Harding is drinking in the White House. He dies. He dies under some questionable circumstances, but he dies before any of these scandals hit the press. And his vice presidency takes his place. His vice president takes his place, Calvin Coolidge. Also on foreign policy, Harding's going to, his administration is going to be represented with the Washington Naval Conference, a conference of the 9 biggest naval powers in the world at the time, largely focused on Far East expansion, so Japan, in which the big naval powers in the world all agree to reduce their navies to a more regulated amount, so we don't get into another like arms race like what got us into World War I with navies. Specifically, it allows for England and Great Britain to lower the U.S. and Great Britain to lower their navy size a little bit, and Japan to lower theirs a lot to try to keep Japan in check via naval disarmament. Like I said, he dies. Coolidge takes office. Coolidge takes the last 2 years of Harding's term and then gets elected to his own 4 years. And the best thing I can tell you for Coolidge is his famous line, helps sum up his whole presidency in one line. So does Harding's. The business of the American people is business. Okay, all right. So this is going to be a pretty pro-business Pro-business presidency. Got it. You said so. Like that, in that vein, he is going to authorize a significant decrease in taxes. Who likes a decrease in taxes? Rich people. 1924, 1926, and 1928 all see a pretty significant step down in the tax rate in terms of who's paying what in taxes. He's also going to veto a farm subsidy bill. A subsidy is like a government payout to support people. Farmers are struggling. Congress passes a farm subsidy bill to help farmers get back on their feet. He vetoes it. Why? Because he's Calvin Coolidge. He's a Republican. He's pro-business, and he's thus in favor of small government, right? Of not getting involved and not having big government spending, which requires big taxes. There we go. On the foreign policy front, it's Coolidge's presidency that's going to be represented in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928. It's this hilarious agreement by a bunch of countries that come together, and they all agree that war is not the answer. They all denounce the use of war to solve their problems, right? Which is a great idea until somebody starts a war. It's a non-binding agreement, obviously, but it is an attempt and a continuation of 1920s policies that are aimed at isolationism and diplomacy instead of force, trying to learn some of the lessons from World War I so as to not end up back in that situation. It's Coolidge's presidency that approves of the National Origins Act of 1924, one of the more egregious immigration policies in the nation's history, that setting of 2%, right, via the 1890 census. So going back to when America was a whiter country and setting our caps for immigration back there. That's going to stay on the books until the 1960s. So we're going to see a significant decrease in the diversity of immigration to the U.S., which I would, again, argue is a continuation of what we saw at the beginning of the 1880s with the Chinese Exclusion Act. This again shows U.S. federal government spending dropping significantly, which is one of the chief hallmarks of this return to normalcy, right? Smaller government means less spending, less regulation, et cetera, as the government's running a pretty decent surplus by not spending much in the facilitation of their government. This cartoon is pretty fantastic. We have Calvin Coolidge driving the car, and his Secretary of the Treasury, the guy responsible for the tax rates, Andrew Mellon behind him. Looks pretty cozy there. And they're careening down this hill, right, of tax reduction, getting faster and faster and faster, as Democrats and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce are saying, speed it up more, it's good for the economy. And the question is, will the brakes hold? Right? Will the brakes hold? What happens when you go too fast on tax reduction? I don't know. Maybe we'll find out next week. So looking at the 1920s through both of those lenses, right, the return to normalcy, we see this dedication and desire for progressive reform going away, as World War I is going to really usher in a more conservative and isolationist society politically. We see a reinvigoration of American business prosperity, American consumerism through the 1920s. But underneath all this, we see those economic problems that I discussed a little bit ago, but also really the increase in urban and rural divisiveness, right? As all those changes of consumerism and culture are really dominated in urban areas, while rural America is consuming more fundamentalist ideologies. We're going to see that almost like a new great awakening of religion with radio sermons and the like, which is really a response to some of these changes. So it's important to contextualize all that's happening in the 1920s through like the pro-business perspective, as well as like the social divide between change and staying the same on the societal front. Now, 1928, at the very tail end of the 1920s, the Republicans nominate Herbert Hoover, freaking Herbert Hoover. He runs against Al Smith, right? Pretty exciting name there, Al Smith, the whitest name of all time. There it is. And Al Smith actually is the first Catholic major party candidate, which is a big deal. The Democrats embrace their urban support by nominating a Catholic. But unfortunately, by nominating a Catholic in a country that half of which doesn't like Catholics, think about the KKK in the 20s being very anti-Catholic. A lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment is because those immigrants are Catholic. So Democrats nominating a Catholic maybe wasn't the wisest political choice. But alas, I don't think it would have mattered who they nominated, because the economy looks so successful and the Republicans are taking credit for that because they've been in power for the last 8 years, that the Republicans were likely to win the presidency no matter what. Alas, we can learn a lot from the Democrats nominating Al Smith. Smith is going to kind of split the Democrats. We always talk about what happens when a party gets split. The other party can take advantage. Smith, of course, as a Catholic, is anti-prohibitionist, anti-prohibition of alcohol, like many urban Catholics are at the time. Smith is associated with Tammany Hall, the New York political machine. So a lot of the Southern Democrats who are pro-prohibition and anti-Catholic are going to vote Republican instead, which is going to begin the process by which the Southern states begin embracing more Republican Party ideologies. Republicans are going to nominate Herbert Hoover, and his job to run for president is easy. You can say, well, first, I'm not Catholic. That's one. Second, the Republican Party's been killing it for the last 8 years. Vote for me, and we will continue the conservative policies that have gotten us in such a good place. The conservative policies like tax cuts, like deregulation, that are responsible for all the success that we see around us here in the 1920s. We've been successful. Vote for me. We'll keep being successful. We'll stay prosperous. And there we go. And sure enough, look at the election map. He kind of kills it. Al Smith does not do so well. In this election. But he is, of course, the first major Catholic, major party candidate. The first Catholic actual president doesn't come until the 1960s with JFK, and Joe Biden was just elected as the second Catholic president. Hoover, not a great president, but he does give us this fantastic campaign pin, which I wish I had in my collection. Hoover for president always makes me smile, has for years, as we see his campaign mascot, the owl, saying Hoover for president. This is about as good as it gets for Hoover, because as soon as he takes the presidency, things are going to kind of hit the fan. But we'll save that for next week. I will leave you with this, however. This speech he gives to the Republican Party when they nominated him to be president, he says in August of 1928, unemployment is disappearing. All right, dope. That's good news. We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. America is close to ending poverty. Dope. That's good. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We've not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward, this is important, to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, right? Let me do what Harding did. Let me do what Coolidge did. If we have a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. We are this close to ending poverty. Continue with these Republican policies, and we're going to end poverty. There is no guarantee against poverty that's as good as a job for every man. That is the primary purpose of the economic policies we advocate. Well, that's good to know. You've now taken credit for the last 8 years of economic growth, which means you get to take the blame when things don't quite go so well. That's it for our video. Hope that was helpful in really understanding the underlying economic issues that are at play in the 1920s. And I can't wait for our live session next week. Have a good rest of your day. Thanks, y'all.